Hello, thank you for coming this morning. My name is Tanaka. I use she, her pronouns, and I am an interdisciplinary artist with a practice grounded in drawing and printmaking. My tendency and intention is to meet spaces, objects, and relationships with patience and attention to detail. In my work, I engage with the following actions: to tend, to care for, and to pay attention to. In a sentence, through my work, I state my belief in the power and potential of the small. In my practice, I favor repetitive, labor-intensive processes, lifting up notions of domestic labor and craft. This is due in large part to my upbringing, which was grounded in frugality, skill building, mending, making, and cooking. The economy in the kitchen is especially important to my studio practice. As Chef Tamar Adler writes in her text on home cooking, An Everlasting Meal, meals ingredients must be allowed to topple into one another like dominoes. This is the way that I treat my studio practice. I think of my studio as a microcosmic ecosystem where I work in cycles of material and conceptual generation and regeneration. As I've noted before, I favor labor-intensive processes such as ink making, drawing, printmaking, collage, and paper making. I'm going to talk a lot about process today because process is in itself a main subject of my work. This fall, I began gathering my own drawing and ink making supplies. I'm working on an ongoing series of drawings that I call the beach fire drawings, which are created using foraged charcoal that I find from spent beach fires on the edges of bodies of water in the Midwest. I'm often informed by the text Make Ink by Jason Logan, who started the Toronto Ink Company. One ink from that text that's very important to me is an oxidized copper ink. It's important to me because as a printmaker, one of the media I use is copper plate intaglio. So copper scraps are a byproduct of that process. Pictured here, I have copper scraps before, after, and during the ink making process. And here's an image of what it looks like to print a copper plate on a printmaking press. I also use the byproduct of the ink making process and actually use that in a more sculptural way. So I've begun to embed oxidized copper in plaster. Pictured here is a plaster print, which is an archaic form of printmaking combined with embedded oxidized copper. So far in our studio ecosystem, I've talked about drawing, ink making, and printmaking. The next phase of that ecosystem is collage. I began a series of collages that I refer to as laminations in 2020. So these are created by building up 8 to 10 layers of old prints and proofs, a byproduct of the printmaking process, to create a very sturdy substrate on which I work additively and subtractively, thinking about erosion and accumulation on the surface of the earth. And then here I have the final phase of my studio ecosystem, which is paper making. So all of the scraps from the collage and printmaking processes I save, and then these scraps can be repurposed and turned into handmade paper, which is a very labor-intensive process. And usually my friend and peer Jeannie and I do this together to make it a little bit more fun and build community. So within my studio ecosystem, I have learned, of course, that resourcefulness is very practical, but I've also learned that it's very beautiful. And thinking further about resourcefulness, I turned to artist Ruth Asawa, who was a sculptor, mother, and educator, born in 1926 in California. With Asawa, I share both the conceptual and biographical lineage. Asawa was incarcerated at Rohr Japanese internment camp during World War II. My grandparents were incarcerated at Manzanar during the same time. And based on my knowledge and experience as a fourth generation Japanese American, resourcefulness is one cultural attribute that was a strong presence within the internment camps and has been passed on through the generations. This image is by photographer Imogen Cunningham and shows Ruth at work with her children. She always worked in a studio within her house surrounded by her many children. And pictured here are her most famous sculptures, her hanging wire sculptures. She learned the technique to make these sculptures from basket weavers in Mexico as a young woman, and she used this process and expanded upon it for her entire lifetime. The sculptures are made from a very humble material, just a packing wire. And so her sculptures show resourcefulness in both material and also concept and method. With Asawa, I share a few formal similarities in our artwork, but I do share the concepts of resourcefulness, repetition, labor, and craft. A contemporary artist who works a lot in repetition and the everyday is Jim Hodges. And I have been looking at Jim Hodges frequently since his mid-career survey at the Walker Art Center in 2014. The piece that has stuck with me the most through the years is A Diary of Flowers. He created drawings of flowers every day for several years on deli napkins, and the iterations of this piece are pinned directly to the wall. As Ian Barry writes in his monograph on Hodges, Jim Hodges transforms ordinary objects into poignant art. Likened to souvenirs of lived experience, his work exposes the innate potential in familiar things. One work that incorporates daily practice and also repetition is my work Stacks from this year, created from recycled paper and ephemera. These small collages are pinned to the wall using custom clay tacks, which each cast their own unique shadow. And most recently, I've been thinking more about installation, site specificity, and viewer interaction with my work. I've been informed by the text Interiors, which was based on the exhibit If You Lived Here, You'd Be Home by Now by the Hessel Museum of Art. In this exhibit, the curator brought domestic objects into the gallery space in order to influence the way that viewers engaged with the artwork. Here's another detail shot of my most recent installation, Tending, where I brought these domestic vessels into the gallery space and actually outside of the gallery space as well. And as I look forward into my thesis work next semester, I'm thinking more about how viewers might literally interact with these works, potentially holding these vessels or interacting with them by rearranging them. And at my final critique of the semester, my classmates actually noticed that a squirrel was interacting with one of my objects that was placed outside. This was a great way to end the semester, and I think a great way to end this artist talk. So I would be happy to answer any questions you might have about process and research.
Wonderful. Thank you, Anda. I love this squirrel as a cap. While we give people a moment to compose their thoughts and questions for the chat, I wonder if you have any links or things that you might like to share for people in the chat, like a website link or Instagram. And I have a question to launch off while people are still forming their thoughts. I loved the inside-outside nature of those small vessels moving both in the gallery and outside. And I wondered if this was the first time you had experimented with that concept, or if you see it going forward into the future.
Yes, it is the first time that I have shown work outside. I was definitely like 100% influenced by that specific space in the MFA gallery. Like I walked into that space and then I noticed the continuation of like the window ledge made a perfect continuation of the stone wall outside. So it was just immediately like, oh, I can place objects outside in like a continuation of the indoor space. But I think it will be something that I take forward because my work engages a lot with landscape. I touched on that super briefly, but it makes sense for me to, I forage materials from the outside. It makes sense for me to give something back to the outside.
Wonderful. Thank you. And I see we have a question from Lucas in the chat. Your work is so resourceful, and I love that you gather and recycle your materials. How has this changed your mindset of buying packaged materials?
Yes. I think it's just like, I've always been, interested in being as sustainable as possible, but this really teaches me that like, I hardly have to buy anything actually. Like artists often like buy charcoal, but like charcoal is so easy to find and even just to make. So, and I think it is a good practice to practice this in my studio because it can then extend, into my daily life and make me think about, how to be as, least wasteful as possible, everywhere in my kitchen in the way that I consume.
Wonderful. And here's a question from Kate. She asks, do you seek to tell narrative with the found ephemera used in installation? Would you, there we go. Would you like an audience to form their own meaning when engaging with the work?
I do want the audience to be able to intuit that there is material relationships between the objects, because all the objects that I have in any given installation they'll all be interrelated. So I don't need people to like make one-to-one relationships between objects, but I do want them to sense that there is a connection between the objects. And I would like people to kind of form their own connections. And I guess, the goal of my work is that like someone might, leave the gallery and like notice a really interesting crack in the sidewalk that they might not have noticed before because they're in that mode of close looking.
Wonderful. Next, we've got a question from Anna who says, wonderful presentation. What came first in your selection of materiality in the beginning? The material itself, because you're simply drawn to it visually or tactily, or, sorry, I've got this scrolling here, or the desire to reuse objects and remain sustainable?
Yeah. When you're thinking in cycles, it's kind of like a chicken or egg thing. So it's kind of hard to pinpoint. I came up with the studio ecosystem like idea during the pandemic. So, I didn't have access to a printing press anymore. So I started to use just like glue all these old prints together. So I guess it really started with, recycling paper. And I love paper, as, printmakers, printmakers are totally obsessed with paper, and like, wasting paper is just like, it's very expensive and it's just so beautiful.
Wonderful. All right. And then Kaylee asks, wonderful presentation, Anda. I'd love if you could elaborate on how you consider how you share the resourcefulness or recyclable aspects of your work. Do you intend for them to be inspired by your process when seeing your work?
So I don't want to be like super didactic in my work, like, everyone should recycle. I think it's more about like slowing down, being patient, and like attending to the small details of life, because I think that if you do that, the sustainability and the recycling and that cyclical notion will just come naturally.
Wonderful. And I think we'll do this as our last question from Shoshana. You spoke a lot about repetition in your work. How does this repetition function exactly? What do you want the viewer to take away from this repetition?
Yeah, so repetition for me can function in multiple ways. One way, since I am interested in this, like in smallness, is that like one of the powerful things about smallness is that small objects or ideas can build up into a larger structure. So repetition of small objects is one way that I can express that particular concept. I think I'll leave it at there. Yeah,
Okay.
I could go
Sure.
on and on about repetition.
No. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm seeing, I'm going to leave this to you, Anda. There's one more question in the chat from Shauna. So I'll let you answer that in the chat.
Okay.
Sounds good. Okay. Thank
Thank
you, Anda.
you.
Everybody, let's give Anda a round of applause. Kudos.